Awesome. Cool beans. Hi, Kathleen. Hi, Martha. Welcome. Manny, I see you and your background. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from London. It's nice to meet everyone. That's not actually where it's a background in that is behind me, but it's not like a picture. Just a very booky room.
Knowledge. Okay, cool. Awesome. So it's 2:05. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker who's going to run through this workshop with us that I'm very excited about. So Michael, the one in the aloha shirt and, you know, groovy background over there, is a creative director, an entrepreneur in his own right. His work been featured in so many places, right? TechCrunch, Wired, Scientific Americans. He and I shared a love for the collective design approach, and he runs a product studio called Weirdo. They partner with in-house teams to bring emerging technology to life, going to market from 0 to 1, right? I'm sure he's gonna talk more about himself and what they do. And we partner with Weirdo from a Taylor collective approach. Remember when I said that Michael and I love the collective model? And Taylor Collective is a group of independent designer researcher who are passionate about the power of technology to advance humanity, right? So our motto is do good, no harm. And we work on social driven, impact driven projects with startup consultancy, all the makers with all the dreams, right? So I pasted in the chat a few links that I'll repeat for those who just joined. But you know, the topic of today workshop is you know, Michael and I both we're both a knowledge sharer, right, educator, and we thought that, you know, in this climate where startups and product designers are working fast and having to go to market quickly with a lot of uncertainty, why don't we hold a workshop on product experimentation? So without further ado, I'll let Michael do his thing, because this is honestly what he does on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I am just going to start with the caveat that this presentation that I've prepared today is a reconfiguration of another talk that I've done, and I have to really recognize some of the sources that I've drawn from, particularly for this talk, just because it wouldn't be fair to them. In particular, my good friend and colleague, Stuart Balcombe. He is a researcher and designer that has spoken at length about a lot of things I'm going to be talking today. And then also folks like Erica Hall, a user researcher who wrote the very excellent book, Just Enough Research. And then Marty Kagan, who wrote the book Inspired, who speaks a lot about product and process around how to build products that people will love. So with that out of the way, I'm going to get started and share my screen. Let me see if you can, let me know if you can see my screen. Okay. I think, hold on, if it's in. If it's in.
It's not a Zoom call without the screen sharing.
Yeah. Classic, right?
Classic. There you go. Yeah, we can see it.
I think if I'm going in full screen, it takes me out of sharing. Does anyone know how to address that? Yeah,
we can see.
Sharing
Yeah.
is paused. You can see? even if I move between slides right now? I've moved between slides. Have you seen? Do you see?
Oh no, we
Still
only see
seeing
the
the
No.
title.
You'll cut this out of the recording, right? Let's see here. Sorry about that, folks.
Sorry. Even if you keep the ledger on the side,
Yeah, maybe I
it's
might
fine.
just keep it, yeah, without just full screen.
Yeah, give us a view
Okay.
into the future. It's cool. You see that? Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about experimentation. You know, I constantly get questions from clients, from colleagues about when do I know whether or not what I'm doing is the right thing to proceed with, right? Like there's a lot of ideas, a lot of good problems to solve. How do we start to build a process around understanding how to move forward with product development? And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. Happy to have a conversation afterwards. I tend to be pretty conversational. I don't really like it to be one way. And I'd be very curious to hear everyone's experiences with this exact challenge in their own work and in their own lives. Really quickly, a little bit about me. I am a designer and creative director. I founded the product design studio and collective Weird Design, as who so gracefully introduced me. I started my career as a journalist, so writing stories in arts, tech, and culture, before slowly moving over to the advertising world and ultimately the tech world, working on educational games at MIT, specifically focused on how playful experiences can improve outcomes in schools. And so that was a really interesting pathway into the tech world. I had my experience getting involved with early stage startups. I co-founded one called Switch Up, which was a review platform for technology boot camps and programs. We sold that company in 2018. So I've really seen the life cycle of various startups in different industries over the past 6 to 7 years. So to start, I'm going to start with this wonderful quote from this, maybe depending on your point of view, not so wonderful person. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns, that is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we do not know. And so this is really where I want to start with my conversation today, which is to do product development successfully, we have to acknowledge the reality, which is we cannot truly know whether or not a product is going to succeed before we start, right? I often get the question from clients, how can we be confident, or how can we validate this concept so that when I do commit my investment into this product, I know it will succeed? And to that, I always say, I can't guarantee that. And so I think starting from this position is very helpful in terms of really understanding the framework I'm going to set out for today. In fact, recognizing what we don't know is actually what helps us be effective as people who develop products. So really through experimentation, which we'll talk about, the goal is to help gather evidence to address what we don't know, right? And the outcomes of this are several-fold. One, to understand the problem. Two, to replace the assumptions that we start with learning and insight. Three, to increase our confidence about the outcome of the product. And four, to decrease overall risk. But keep in mind, again, that here, none of this involves actually saying this will succeed, because that is, of course, something we'll never be able to truly say with 100% confidence.
So I'd be curious, just a show of hands, how many people are familiar with this brand, Juicero, or this company and its story? Anyone here? No, okay, so maybe this might be new to a couple of you. Some of you may have heard of it. I'll talk a little bit about it, okay? A company several years ago raised $120 million, not an insignificant amount in terms of a VC round of funding. And what did it do? It was $699 product of so-called advanced technology. And I quote something from this podcast here, which is talking about one of the founders essentially revolutionizing juice, right? So what this was a device that exerted 8,000 pounds of pressure to cold press the freshest juice possible from QR-coded organic produce packs that contain detailed information on nutrition, farm of origin, and date of harvest. And so in this quote, they talk a lot about space-age functionality, highly complex machinery, cutting-edge design courtesy of legendary product designer Yves Bihar that expertly merges aesthetics with simplicity and user-friendliness. Comparisons to Apple are inevitable, right? So we have this really hyped up product, some glowing press and reviews about the experience that it delivers. And then we end up with this. Can you hear? So this is really what I'm here to talk about today. And really, I think it is like the perfect summation of why experimentation is important, right? And we'll talk about this tragedy of Juicero, which is essentially this company completely crashed and burned once they discovered that something that cost $400 to make could actually be addressed by simply taking out those juice packs and squeezing it into a cup, right? And what I think is so amazing about this example is it's a really truly indicative representation of why building things well doesn't mean success, right? It doesn't matter how well you build something if what you build is not valuable. So there's a distinction between building something well and building the right thing, which is what experimentation is here to address. So a couple quotes, if there is no problem, there is no solution and no reason for a company to exist. If I were given 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it, right? As people who work on products, we tend to quickly go to the idea, right? We have these shiny toys in terms of these solutions that we have in our mind that we think will address some problem. And that's often where the problem starts or the challenge starts, which is we assume without any validation, without any experimentation, that the idea we have in our head is going to be what will be a successful product. And I'm here today to talk about why that's potentially a troubling approach to product development. So number one, right, we want to talk about, we need to be solving the right problem, right? So it's easy to chase solutions and find yourself going down in a deep, dark hole and not knowing whether or not it actually addresses any valuable problem that we actually need to build a solution around. And so whenever someone gives you either a problem or a solution in developing products, the first thing that we always want to ask is, what is the problem and why is it worth solving, right? And why is that? So I really want to talk about this concept of opportunity cost, right? We all know the expense of building the wrong thing, right? You're sinking in time, money, resources into building something that might fail. But there's this other hidden cost, which is, what are you losing out on by not building the right thing when you're building the wrong thing? And so, there are a couple of data points that I think are interesting. There was a study done by CB Insights where they polled a number of startups, and they found that 42% of startups fail because there was no market need, right? So even though they built something, perhaps it was even interesting or well-made, but ultimately it couldn't find traction because no one actually needed what they were offering. And again, another sort of like postmortem analyzed 300 failed startups, and they found at least 11.1% failed because there was no market need. So all this to say is there's a lot of companies out there that are just building something that no one needs, and they're not addressing that upfront, right? And these bad decisions get worse, right? These are bad bets that founders, early stage teams are making, even companies that are well mature are making, that compound over time, right? And we talk about 3 errors that people tend to make when doing this. One is, and this is sort of the Juicero example, conflating building the thing with deciding what to build. And you assume that these two are one and the same. Secondly is adding to a product, or we always love to throw on this word of MVP, without actually understanding if what you're adding is valuable to the people who are ultimately going to be paying for it and paying for the salaries of the people making it. And then finally, they take too long in getting to market, right? And so again, these decisions have a cost, not just in terms of the resources you're spending, but in terms of what you're not getting right. And so I want to talk a little bit about this concept of the build, measure, learn loop. You may have heard of this from Eric Ries's Lean Startup book. It's a very commonly touted mantra of how startups get built and how they succeed. But I want to spend today kind of turning that on its head. We should not be building first. In fact, I would actually propose that we might want to think of a process that starts with learning. And maybe this is my background in working in educational games, but I fundamentally think that MVP development in particular really is focused on understanding what you don't know, so that when you actually build what you are going to build and ship to customers, you have far better insight into knowing what will succeed and what will not. And so when we talk about making bets, right, our goal is to remove that opportunity cost or reduce that opportunity cost that we've been talking about. So these good bets have to be smart and constrained. And we'll talk a little bit about how we do that later on. So really, these are the questions that we're here to address today, right? Like, how do we identify the ideas worth pursuing? And how do we know the problems that are worth solving? And experimentation is the vehicle at which we address this. But these are the top questions in mind that we should always have when we're working on these products. So Marty Kagan, who's written the book Inspired, talks about this in terms of his framework for understanding risk. And he defines risk in 4 ways, right, in terms of developing products. 1 is, will customers buy or choose to use the product? 2 is, can customers figure out how to use the product? 3 is, can the product be built within the time, resources, and skills that the company or the team have available to them? And then finally, does the product create sufficient value for the business itself? I would say typically, in my experience, I'd be curious to hear everyone else's, companies that I've worked with often get very tied up around 3, feasibility, right? Can this be built with the limited resources that we have? And while I think that that's really important and obviously sets a constraint on what is possible, I want to make an argument for number 1 truly being the reason why a lot of these companies fail to get off the ground, and number 2, why experimentation is extremely important, because it really addresses this particular issue before you actually ship the product. And so what experimentation is essentially is creating what I'm calling sort of the learning machine or the learning mechanism in a team, at a company, or for a product. And to this end, there are sort of 3 steps that I want to talk about today, and maybe the first 2 in more detail. So number 1, as we kind of mentioned, is defining the problem, right? So when we are trying to figure out what we're trying to learn, we want to know if the problem is worth solving. And so again, going to spout a lot of these different kinds of frameworks to help us structure our understanding. I particularly like Hittenshaw's very simple 3-question approach. He is the founder of Crazy Egg, a heat mapping software that helps for marketing and analytics. And his 3 questions are: is the problem frequent? Is the problem urgent? And is the problem painful, right? And obviously you want to, this can be relative depending on the customer's experience of the problem. But to understand that baseline and get insight into that baseline is part of that early work that needs to happen as a prerequisite before experimentation can happen, right? So really understand if the problem, if the experiment will be successful, you have to first understand whether or not the problem is the right one to solve. And this is a very helpful framework to really quickly getting a snapshot into whether or not that's true. As a journalist, I always love to ask questions, right? And this is one of the tried and true frameworks that I've known since first grade, right? The 5 W's and 1 H. And so I really talk about this in terms of how you understand the problem, right? If you can't answer these questions, it's likely that you need to do more work before you truly can build a solution that you ship, right? So 1 is, who has this problem? Who's experiencing it? Who is your customer, right? 2 is, what is the nature of the problem? What is happening? 3 is, when does the problem occur? 4 is, where does the problem occur? Why is the problem we're solving? And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, how do they currently solve the problem, right? If your amazing product does not exist in the world, what are they already doing, whether or not it's a competitor or it's some do-it-yourself process that this person has come up with to address the issue? How do they currently solve this problem? And how can your understanding of that process then translate into deciding on a solution that may work better? So once you have that, right, you've sort of defined the questions that you want to answer, you can then go about defining the problem, right? And really all this is about is, again, coming back to the concept of I don't know, right? What do you not know, and what do you need to know to be able to move forward with an experiment? I'm not going to go too deep or really deep at all into sort of research methods today. We can talk about that in Q&A if people want to talk a little bit more about that. But we're going to really focus in on this second step, which is designing the experiment, right? So most importantly, we want to outline the assumptions. If we think about this as risk, right? We're building something, we're spending money, spending resources, spending time to do this. We want to understand all the ways in which it could fail, right? And to bring back to the Donald Rumsfeld quote, there are ways that we know it could fail, and there are ways that we probably don't even know that it could fail. And so part of the goal of designing an experiment and designing that learning machine is to systematize how we approach understanding our assumptions and our open questions. And so early on, especially when you're first starting a product, a lot of your hypotheses may be extremely vague, may be built on complete giant assumptions that you have no bearing in terms of understanding whether or not that actually is true, right? And here are a couple of ones that are very common that you'll hear, right? You think you know who your target market is or who your target user is. You think the problem you're solving is actually painful and that people will pay money to address that pain. And then finally, people will actually be able to see it and know that it exists and therefore buy it. These are all assumptions, right? And they are things that you will have to address in terms of understanding how to build and deliver that product. And so the experiment is designed to address these assumptions and to de-risk the ones that could be costliest in terms of if they actually turned out to be false, they would prove to be detrimental for the success of the company or the product. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to build a system that helps us develop clarity. Here I'm showing an image from an agency based, I think, primarily in Boston, but now they have locations all around the world. Thoughtbot, they have this, their approach to this is building essentially what's called an assumption table. And this may be sort of more in person when you're working with a client or working with a company. And essentially, it's, again, systematically listing out the assumptions, tying those assumptions to experiments that you are going to run to understand whether or not that assumption is actually, in fact, true, right? And so we want to build this out into something that is a knowledge base that folks working on the product can then distribute that knowledge across the team so that there is understanding about what, in fact, you know about the problem and in turn the solution that you're proposing to solve the problem with. So in building this table, whether it's in a meeting, in a kind of short activity, or if it's a longer term kind of system that you're building in resources like Google Sheets or Airtable or Notion or whatever repository you use, the goal is to essentially collect and organize your assumptions and hypotheses, right? As you start to document them and test them, you're going to start to learn about these assumptions and compound your learning over time, right? And so what we like to do is to essentially prioritize our assumptions that we're making in terms of level of risk. And the ones that we are unable to answer in terms of, do we actually know anything about that assumption? What insights do we have to increase our confidence in that assumption? For those that we have little confidence in or are very risky, those are going to be the first ones that we want to test, right? What are the biggest and most obvious ways in which what you're building can fail? So hypothesis might look something like this, right? Something as simple as, if you've done, the scientific method, an experiment before is very similar to what we do in product development, right? You set out a proposed solution. You set out the outcome you are looking for from that solution, and you're tying it to the value that it will have for the business, but also for your end audience, your end customer. And finally, in terms of running an experiment, because otherwise, if you didn't set this, you would just be building the thing, right? And for experiments, the most important thing is capping your risk and setting your boundaries. So how do we do this? It's about the appetite, right? So how much appetite does your team have to run an experiment of this size and scale. And there are a couple of levers you can kind of pull to understand what that appetite is, right? One is your level of uncertainty. Like, how much do you know or don't know about it, and how much do you need to learn? Your risk, right? And we go back to Marty Kagan's framework of values, ability, feasibility, and viability. How much risk is involved across those four areas? And then finally, potential opportunity. Is the payoff large or small? And based on that, you can start to have a set of criteria by which you understand how important it is to experiment on this particular assumption, and how large or how much of an investment you want to make in terms of delivering that investment, right? And this is where sort of understanding MVP and outlining the scale of your MVP is going to come into play. Probably not a great time to mention these folks, but one of the things I do appreciate about the philosophy of the folks at Basecamp is that they have this premise of fixed time, variable scope, right? And this is really, I think, a wonderful way to approach carving out the boundaries of an experiment. So in that sense, what does that mean? Fixed time, setting a set amount of time in which you will build and run that experiment, and capping it at that time. And then variable scope is understanding that you can get to value in a variety of ways, right? Sometimes an MVP, as everyone has talked about, I'm sure you've heard this before, can be something as simple as, you know, a spreadsheet, right? And so we need to measure what our appetite is, and connect sort of the risk that we are willing to take in connection to that, and set a time based on that. You may have seen this in different ways. Google Ventures has the design sprint, where they cap their risk at 1 week. They will test a hypothesis and deliver insights within the span of 1 week. If they can't build it in that week, then it doesn't fit. The scope is already too large, right? Companies like Basecamp with their Shape Up process cap it at 6 weeks. So in 6 weeks, if they cannot build and ship and collect insight on it, the scope is too large. Whatever that time is, and it can really depend, that's something that's really helpful in terms of ensuring an experiment doesn't evolve into just building the thing, right? And that's really important to making sure you're making, again, continual progress, not just on the product, but in terms of your learning. And then finally, of course, we want to understand the outcomes. So now that you've had your assumptions and what you understand to be true in terms of knowing whether or not this assumption was validated or successful, you want to, again, systematize that in and document that in your learnings. And so I had to block out some of this stuff here just for NBA purposes, but it can be something as simple as this, right? Having an understanding around what was validated in testing some of your hypotheses, seeing where there were gaps in what you expected to happen and what actually happened when you put some kind of stimulus in front of your target customer. And then finally, things that you may reconsider entirely. So what failed, or what didn't work, or where were there challenges? Having this kind of structure makes your insights actionable, and then helps you actually turn learning into continued progress. So I like to use, we're about to wrap up, but I really love to use this diagram in particular. This is a diagram I've adapted from Jake Knapp, the creator of the design sprint. But some of you, this may again be familiar to you, some kind of version of the build, measure, learn approach. Once again, right? You start with an idea, you build it, you launch it, you collect the data, and then you iterate, right? And that's sort of the tried and true cycle of what successful product development is. But really, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, this is what tends to happen, right? Build starts to stretch out a little bit longer. And then at some point, you've been building for months and launches down the line, you haven't put it in front of someone to sort of collect that data. And where I'm really trying to kind of push for in my conversation today in terms of what makes experimentation so valuable and so important to product development is really tightening that loop, right? And ultimately what I want to say is that whereas people think minimum viable products, MVPs, are meant for building the thing, they're meant, you're shipping a product to sell right off the bat, I would actually contend that they're actually designed for learning, right? MVPs are the things you build initially to help you learn and to help you outline your riskiest assumptions. And to that end, your metric of success shouldn't be time to market or time to launch, but it should be time to learning. How quickly can I get from identifying an assumption that is likely to cause my product or company to crash and burn? How quickly can I get from that to understanding whether or not that assumption is in fact true or false? That is the loop that we want to tighten up in terms of building experimentation into our processes. And that is hopefully what if you've taken anything away from our conversation today, that's what I hope you'll think about in returning to the products that you work on and thinking about how you can make small changes to accommodate a learning machine in your own work. Thank you so much. I guess I'd love to open up to conversation and questions, and that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. So I'll field some questions in the chat first, and then we can field more questions as they come in. Cool. So Louise have a question on what does Heaton means by urgent. I think when you were talking about the different questions to ask to define the problems. Yep.
Yep, let's return to this. Really good question. I think let's maybe add some detail to each one of these. I think in terms of urgency, what we're trying to get at is the person okay with just letting that problem sit, right? Is it something that they actually need to solve? And while urgency, while frequency, I think may not be as important, urgency and pain are particularly the ones that we want to look at. And so when I talk about urgency, it's if I don't solve it, it will become even more painful to a point where I will have to come up with a solution, whether it's some existing software or some do-it-yourself solution to address that particular problem. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about urgency. Meaning if I don't solve it now, will it come back to bite me later? And how do I feel about sort of that degree of need? And so when we do research, when we do interviews with customers, when we speak to them, that's part of what we're trying to understand is when they tell us about how they address a certain problem currently in their life, we're trying to extract how they feel about it, right? If it is a problem, but it's minor and they can just let it sit and it won't really affect their lives, it's likely that they probably won't pay for a product to address it. Even if you're really passionate about the solution, if there is not enough of a need from the customer standpoint, it's not gonna matter. Hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and I would say too, and Michael, tell us what you think about this, but this truly apply to B2C, but also B2B customers, right? Because
Yeah.
at the end of the line, their users are plentiful.
Yep.
Their employees or people in larger organization, B2B, there's still a measurement of how frequent is the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think like when there are multiple layers involved in terms of the problem, right? That's also something that obviously it adds complexity to sort of the product that you're developing. And it's something that you have to think about in terms of if there are multiple layers that get in the way, is the problem different for those different layers, right? And in terms of B2B, that's absolutely something that you need to consider.
Yeah. And Susan, do you have a point? I wonder if you can share it with everyone.
Hi. Yeah, I was just saying, because I come from the product world as well, and another frame around urgency is in your research, if the people you're talking to are actively spending time or money looking for another solution.
Right.
If their current state is so painful, it's like, or I don't know if you're, they're spending, an hour a day, or they're Googling or obsessively talking to other people trying to figure out how to work around to their current situation.
Yep. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you, Luis, for that question. The second question we have from Chloe is, what does it mean? Why is the problem worth solving?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this brings us back to clarifying and aligning everyone on whether or not the solution you're building is worthwhile, right? If the problem, and this comes back again even to this evaluative framework, right? If the problem isn't that urgent, frequent, or painful for the customer, it's probably not worth spending time, money, resources to build a solution around. And so it's a helpful kind of top level question to always understand whether or not what you're doing is actually valuable for the people who are going to end up paying and subsidizing it, right? And I think when you work at a company and there's a strong sense of culture and there's a strong sort of like a shared vision for the product, it's very easy to forget this particular question, right? Because you're so sort of caught up in the solution before even understanding whether or not it's something people want. I hope that answers your question, Chloe. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that as well. Would love to. Please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, so is it, Michael, do you think that that's in a way an effort to get out of your own internal product team and go seek out stakeholders or people who are actually paying for the solution and ask them, is this worth solving for you? And I guess what is the metric or what's the measurement to that question?
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's hard. We're really like living in the level of abstraction right now. So I think it's hard to maybe give it sort of a more systematic criteria that unless we get into like the details of a specific company or a specific product. But what I would say is that the intention is to tie the work that you're doing to the customer more tightly. And that's really, I think, the reminder that this question really is intended to achieve, is that we want to move the teams that work on the products closer to the customers early on so that they can nip it in the bud if it really turns out that what they're working on isn't actually necessarily something that is worth solving. I don't know if you have thoughts too on how to get more granular with measuring it. Or
Yeah,
Susan,
I-
I think
I
Susan.
was thinking I
Susan
could
has-
share some thoughts too, just because
yeah. Go
you
for it.
know, sometimes when you think about a problem solving, it's also thinking about the impact, like outcomes in terms of the effect on society or the community or the customer's own ecosystem. So they may not know they have a problem, but if it's like for social good, or there's a, you know, more of a purpose-driven need, that could be a case. To get more specific, it could be like in healthcare, trying to increase access, and there could be many ways of solving it, right? So the problem itself, I mean, that's why now you see so many healthcare, I think, startups that keep popping up every day. It seems to be another one trying to improve access, but everybody comes from different walks of life, so there's just different lenses to think about.
Yeah, and that to that end, right? Like I think where I think this is interesting is that while the problem may not be frequent, urgent, or painful for a particular, let's say, set of customers or a particular segment, like these are all helpful frameworks to help you understand, redirect it towards other possibilities as well, right? So it could be that the problem isn't worth solving for this particular audience, but it may be worth solving for another audience. And so really learning sort of all the variables that you can play around with in terms of defining whether or not the problem is worth solving is, I think, really helpful to keep in mind, because just because it doesn't work for the hypothesis you set doesn't mean that a version of it doesn't exist or could exist.
Yeah, that's such a good lens that Susan brought up, right? Like, it doesn't always have to be about money, revenue, power.
Impacts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can be about impact
Totally.
and the reach as well. Yeah, shout out to Michael.
Shout out to Susan.
Yeah, so Runako has a question around timeframes. How would you know which process to use and what are the advantages of one over the other?
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, I think it's good. I think, you know, there's a whole variety of sort of what, you know, what we might call discovery methods or ways of kind of validating these assumptions. I would say I think one is to know sort of, again, to bring it back to the constraints that you have, the resources that you have available to you, right? There are ways in which we can sort of build an entire MVP and kind of and test that with our target customers. But at the same time, there are ways that we can kind of work around building something to put in front of people, right? Another way that has commonly been used is using competitors or alternative solutions and just observing how people use those pre-existing experiences and drawing out insights from that to understand whether or not, again, if the problem is worth solving, and kind of helping refine whether or not your hypothesis could be something that might address the issues that you see in testing things that already exist. So I would say typically I go down sort of two paths. One is really designing the MVP, prototyping something to test that assumption. That can be something as small and simple as, you know, paper prototypes, though they're less in fashion these days, all the way to something that's coded and interactive and takes inputs and spits out outputs. So it's really about, again, measuring the resources that you have and being able to understand what you're willing to put in for that. And again, like, I don't know, Runako, if you have like a particular scenario, we can maybe like workshop it together live right now. But I would say abstractly or generally, that's kind of the approach that I take. And if we don't have time or resources to build a prototype right off the bat, we tend to at least get started. And again, this comes back to building that learning machine, being able to collect insight. We get started with either using competitors as a way to collect that insight, and really not really to understand it. And I don't mean competitors in the sense of doing competitive market research, but I really mean that more in terms of understanding where customers currently are at, right? It's about keeping this process customer-centric and understanding what workarounds or alternative solutions already exist and how they respond to it, because it's already there for you. You don't have to build
Yeah.
anything.
So if you go and build a team management, you want to build a team management tool, go use Monday.com or like Basecamp before you go and build your own, right? Is that what you mean, Michael?
Right. Yeah, and there are, I think, many sort of examples of companies that started by copying pre-existing solutions. Shaw recently talked about the example of Drift and Intercom, two sort of customer success solutions, right, in terms of providing support, help, knowledge, a knowledge base. Drift very much started off by essentially copying Intercom's functionality and using that to collect insight and then pivoting based on what they learned. And so that is also an approach that you may want to consider again. And this is like maybe a more advanced version of starting with the competitor, but it is, a tried and true scenario in the sense of there is another solution out there that does this. And so using that to collect the insight to then inform how you could be different or better is absolutely an approach to product development that has been used before. So yeah, I think that's certainly a way in which you can slightly bypass the challenge of building something net new, or feeling pressured to innovate, quote unquote, off the bat.
Yeah, and I would also say that on my startups as well, what I learned was that before we go and build a digital product, to actually try to do the whole process manually. So for example, we are building a measurement application, right? But before we even put digital pen to screen, we actually go with the measuring tape to our customer and measure them one by one. And just by doing that concierge test, that manual test, there's just something very tangible. The learning is much quicker than if we were to put all of our resources into building a digital solution to mimic that physical experience.
Yeah, there's so many existing tools now and non-code solutions that can help us get there without having to invest in a large engineering team to build our MVPs, right? We look to things like Zapier and like Airtable, Notion, Webflow. There are all these interesting tools now that help us sort of connect different pieces and functionalities to build an MVP that can help us, at least, again, as Tu was saying, collect that insight, collect those learnings. And then once you have reached a threshold of confidence, then you can decide whether or not you want to build it for real.
Well, so we have 2 minutes
left. Your question.
Anybody have any other questions for Michael while we have him? Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I hope this was helpful. Again, like, feel free to, you can tweet me. I'll leave my Twitter. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to chat online. Yeah, I would love to know what you're working on, like the problems you're running into as it relates to experimentation and having confidence in what you're building. I think it's such an interesting and ripe space for exploration. I by no means know everything that there is to know about it, and I'm learning a lot from just seeing how other companies are approaching it. And so I'd love to hear from you and see how you're tackling it. And yeah, would love to continue the conversation there.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, I will share this recording so that some of the framework that Michael walked through very quickly, you can refer back to. Again, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. I'll put Michael LinkedIn and my LinkedIn here as well, right? Reach out. We are really open doors, right? I can know and say for certain that we will reply to every message. Well, try to. But thank you. Thank you for joining. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for being here.